keep up with Team USA with gig speeds over Wi-Fi from Xfinity. Can your internet do that?
Restrictions apply. Not available in all areas. Requires gig internet and compatible gateway. Gig speed Wi-Fi is shareable across all devices. Actual speeds vary and are not guaranteed.
Xfinity, proud partner of Team USA.
In the fight against COVID-19, testing offers another layer of protection in addition to vaccines. Go to vdh.virginia.gov and search by zip code to find a free COVID-19 test near you. A message from your Virginia Department of Health.
Attention all listeners on this frequency. Stand by for an important announcement.
Welcome to Medic Podcast, the weekly podcast for EMS providers, EMS leaders, EMS medical directors, and others involved in or those who have an interest in emergency medical services. Ladies and gentlemen, here's your host, Steve Cohen.
Coming from the Pacific Northwest studios of Medic Podcast. Hi, it's Steve Cohen, and welcome to another episode of Medic to Medic. You can download this podcast at Spreaker.com, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and your other favorite podcast platforms. If you want to reach the host, you can reach me at medicamedicpodcast@gmail.com. Please go to Spreaker.com and Facebook and like both of my pages. Today, I am joined by Joe Bartels, who after 33 years just retired from the Bellingham Fire Department. Joe was one of the first paramedics to welcome me to my new position and has been very welcoming and gracious and teaching me a lot about the system. Joe is a paramedic, educator, spent time as an officer, and is a creator of the High Performance CPR program for the Bellingham Fire Department and assisting in the systems implementation of this type program countywide. So Joe, welcome to Medic Podcast.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to be here.
Well, how does it feel to be retired?
I like it. I like it a lot.
Yeah, well,
it feels good. It's good to sleep.
33 years, that's a lot of time working for Bellingham Fire Department. We'll get into your career in a little bit. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you grew up?
Well, my father was a Navy officer, and we moved around a lot until after high school, and graduated from high school in Pensacola, Florida in '74, and followed my family up here to Bellingham, Washington, and I fell in love with the place and decided to stay, try out the civilian life.
Was your move because your dad's military up to this area, or was he retiring and you decided to move to Bellingham?
Yeah, it was his last station up here, and I'm the oldest of a family of 11, so they needed some help moving up here, and I had actually planned to go back to Florida, but I really liked it up here, and decided to stay and enjoy the mountains, the forests, all the recreational activities that they have up here.
Joe, why don't you describe our area? You kind of just did a real nice job of, we've got mountains, we've got water, and that's what attracted you. And me being from the East Coast, actually, this has been very nice. This is just a great environment. It's a great place to live. I can see why you fell in love. My wife and I also fell in love living in the area. What was it specifically that you fell in love with in Bellingham?
I like the vertical terrain. There's a lot of up and down in this area. There's a dormant volcano at the east end of the county, 50 miles to the end of the road there, where there's a ski area, Mount Baker ski area, beautiful Mount Baker. And to the south, there's a bank of hills that separate us from the nearest county to the south. To the north, it's the Canadian border. And to the west, we have the beautiful San Juan Islands. And there's just a ton of recreational opportunities here. Kayaking, skiing, mountain biking. We have a world-class mountain bike destination here in Galbraith Mountain. It's just right on our back door.
When you moved here in 1975, what did you do? You graduated high school. Did you have any plans, and what did you do?
I didn't really have plans. I didn't have a lot of direction as a youth, and I decided to try college, and I lasted about a year, and I was just too restless at the time, and tried my hand at building boats several years. Got bored with that, and tried grocery sales for several years and got bored with that. And eventually I realized that there were opportunities in the fire service in this area.
What got you interested in building boats?
Well, it was just a very tough time to be employed in Whatcom County in those days. In the late 70s, there were court decisions that limited salmon fishing, so the salmon fisheries were dying, and that put a lot of people in the market for a job. And at the same time, the logging industry was taking a hard hit. So there was a lot of competition for jobs at the time. Building boats was something that I was able to land at the time. And I seem to recall that for a period there, unemployment rate was about 13% in Whatcom County. It was hard to get a job. So I had worked at Uniflight. We built large boats, up to 60-foot yachts. It was hard work. That was fiberglassing. And I didn't really enjoy it that much.
You mentioned that you saw opportunities in the fire department. What did you know about the fire service and public safety before the opportunity came up?
Nothing really. I grew up in a pre-EMS era. When I was going to high school in Florida, we had frequent grass fires behind our house, and the local fire department would show up with a grass rig and a bunch of mud flaps on sticks and hand them out to the neighborhood. And we'd walk around slapping out the fire, and that was pretty much community oriented. If you were present, you were part of the fire department till the fire was out. But there was no EMS. When one day my youngest brother, 5-year-old brother, was crossing the highway. We lived on a state highway. And he was struck by a car, and he was very badly injured and looked like a rag doll. He had 3 angulated limbs and was screaming some crazy stuff. Both eyes were swollen shut. And the neighborhood turned out, and nobody really knew what to do. Somebody ran off and started leafing through a phone book to find somebody to call to come get him. And eventually, they called the nearest naval hospital, and because my dad was in the Navy, they sent out a couple of corpsmen in an ambulance. The state troopers got there first, and they joined us, just watching my brother, and it was almost 30 minutes before anybody arrived. And when they did, it was just a couple of guys in their uniforms who really didn't have any EMS skills. They just picked my brother up and put him on a stretcher and drove away. Unfortunately, he survived. He was in a body cast for 6 months with just one arm free. But he made it through that. But there wasn't any such thing as EMS in many parts of the country in those days. And I hadn't been exposed to much of it. And the fire department exposure I had was pretty minimal. And so when I had basically banged around enough up here doing stuff that I wasn't really that satisfied with, I found out that there was a chance to volunteer at the fire department. I didn't know that EMS was a part of that. And I only found out after I went and applied and was accepted.
Tell us about your experience with volunteering, and where did you volunteer, and what was your first exposure to EMS when you were volunteering? I
started volunteering at District 8 in Whatcom County, just outside of Bellingham, a bordering agency. It was all volunteer at the time. They had a paid chief. And it was kind of Wild West. There was a closet that I dug my turnout gear out of, and it was pretty thin. It didn't fit that well. People would jump on a moving fire engine when it took off from a call. It was a little bit crazy. We were fortunate, though, in that in the first couple of months I was there was an airport expansion. It's situated at the end of a runway, and we had 13 buildings to burn in 3 months, and we sure made use of that. We were out there every weekend burning buildings, putting them out, starting them again. It gave me enough experience in a short amount of time that I was able to hire on with Bellingham Fire Department that year. The EMS experience, though, was pretty haphazard. At the time, there were 2 medic units, 2 ALS units in Whatcom County, and they did all the EMS transports. And EMTs, BLS providers were basically gurney getters and blood pressure takers. To me, though, my first experience at a motorcycle wreck, to watch the medics operating in the back after we put that patient in the back was very eye-opening, because I had no idea that people were actually doing this sort of stuff. They were very impressive.
Please describe how big our county is. When you say two paramedics or two paramedic units, I mean, I think the listeners would like to know how big our county is.
It's 30 miles north to south, and at the end of the road heading east, we have that mountain, and that's 50 miles east, and the county extends quite a long ways beyond that. I'm sure there are countries in the world that are smaller than this county. The areas that we would transport, we could have more than an hour transport easily, all on the road. Sometimes if we got off the road, recently I had an hour and a half extrication off of Galbraith Mountain for a patient who had a flail chest after a mountain bike accident. And so if we were way back there in the woods, we could spend 3 or 4 hours with a critically injured patient.
And the other thing that people need to know is, I assume it was the same thing back then. There was only one hospital. There's only one hospital now, and that makes it kind of easy. You know where you're going 99% of the time, unless you're going to fly a patient out. And I guess that was the same thing back then. There was only St. Joe's back then too.
Oh, in those days, there was a hospital across the street from your office on Chestnut, which was St. Luke's, and that was the trauma center for us. The medical and OB would go to St. Joe's. Wow,
I didn't know that. Huh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I look at that emergency room entrance every day outside my window. That's kind of interesting on the history behind that. And so you get hired by Bellingham Fire Department in 1988. You became an EMT. And how much time did you spend in the ambulance versus the fire truck?
On probation, I was assigned to the fire engine, and I acquired my EMT during that probationary year. But before the year was over, we had some staffing shortfalls, and I ended up driving the medic unit for some veteran medic. And that was an occasional thing. It was a hard thing because I didn't really have any training for it. It was not a desirable position, and so it was always a case of the most junior firefighter being assigned to drive the medic unit. And that drove the medics a little bit crazy because they could never depend on working with somebody who had really any idea what was going on the call or how to help. Perhaps couldn't even set up a tube to assist the medic or IVs. And so if you could get into that environment as an EMT and make yourself useful, that was quite an advantage. The upshot of that is that eventually they offered the medic schedule to EMTs to take those spots, and I chose to do that because I was junior and I was going to be on there anyway.
You mentioned medic schedule. Can you explain that, please?
In those days, we were a 3-platoon fire department, and the way those are configured, we would have 24 on, 48 off, and the 8th shift for a firefighter would be a Kelly day, would be a scheduled day off. And for the medics, because they had a higher call load and because they were having a harder time staffing the medic units, had every 5th day scheduled as a Kelly day.
What made you decide to go to medic school?
That's actually a moment I remember pretty well. I had got myself assigned to the medic unit, and we had, I was still very green, but learning the ropes somewhat. But I hadn't been on any big calls where I had to make a decision at all. Decisions were always made by the medics. And it was nighttime in the fall, I think, early winter. We went to a pickup truck versus car several miles out of town on the state highway. And when we arrived, my partner and I, there was bodies strewn all over a field, cars upended. And we were in pretty deep, pretty fast. The volunteers who had arrived before us had a patient who was unresponsive, on a stretcher, and they put him in the back of the ambulance, and my medic partner went back there and started working on this patient. And I really didn't know what to do, but I knew that I was expected to make sure that as the other units arrived, that the patients were ready for them. And so I wandered around and did something of what I thought triage should be, and started assigning volunteers to take the patients and get them ready. And I made my way to this SUV that was on its side, and it was up on the passenger side. And inside there was some children in the back, and a woman on the passenger side with a man hanging down from the driver's seat. And I busted out the windshield and got in there, and he had been struck right in the door by a pickup truck that had blown a stop sign. And the woman was conscious, and the man wasn't. She was pregnant. She was about 8 months pregnant. And I had to get the fellow out of the seatbelt, and it was hung up pretty badly with his weight on it. And she asked me if he was dead, and I said, yeah, I think he is. And she said, yeah, I thought so. I'm a nurse. And I was pretty affected by that. I hadn't been in any situations like that, and I really wasn't prepared for it. But I got myself over top of her, rattled, and got her husband cut down and pulled him out. Then I extricated her, and I got the children out. And in the end, everybody ended up in an ambulance. And then there was an ambulance that showed up with a medic for the last patient. This medic was the most intimidating man I'd ever met. He'd been shot down in a helicopter 3 times in Vietnam, and he was always in charge. Giant of a man, actually. He walked up to me and said, "Who's in charge?" And, the proper answer would have been, "You are." But at this point, I needed to get that last patient to the hospital, and I said, "Well, I am. Here's your patient." So when it was all said and done, they all arrived at the hospital alive and remained alive. The only fatality actually was the husband. And I felt like I had done a pretty good job. I felt pretty good about it. And so when I went to our CE, our continuing education class, the next day, after I got off shift, this was the subject of conversation, this call. And I was ready for some praise. And it didn't come. The medics were unimpressed. I had put the driver of the pickup in with the mother who they struck in the same ambulance, and that medic was pretty displeased with it. And I was told that my triage wasn't very good and that I had a lot of work to do on it. And, I was feeling kind of crestfallen. But then this medic, this intimidating medic that I'd spoken of, he basically spoke up and said the words that would direct my career from that point on. He said, "Well, that's why we need EMS officers. So Joe Bertels isn't in charge." And it was kind of a hard thing to hear at the time, but I also knew in that moment that if I were going to make a career out of this, I needed to step up and become a medic. And that's basically when I decided to take that route.
Wow. That's a pretty good story there, Joe, and you remember it like it was yesterday, don't you?
I sure do. I remember everybody who was in that room.
Talk about medic school, and what was it like when you attended?
Bellingham Fire Department ran its own medic school. We had a classroom in a nearby community college, and we would work our regular shift, and we would be relieved during the week for day shift if we had class during the week. Other than that, we would be working on the medic unit with a preceptor. It was a 2-person rig, and it was pretty intense. We had a year to get through the didactic portion, the clinicals, and get out of evals. It was pretty tightly scheduled. They didn't give a lot of leeway. If you were lagging, if you were having trouble, there wasn't a lot of hand-holding to get through it. In fact, it felt a little bit like hazing, institutional hazing in a way. But it was a heck of a year. I made some good friends, and it was a very memorable time.
Today, it's a little different. The firefighters that want to become paramedics go to school for a year, and that's what they do for the whole year. They concentrate on medic school, and they do their clinical times, and I assume that would have been great if you could have done that back then. But I guess the way you went through medic school made you the paramedic you are today. Yes or no?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was I was actually cursed with a little bit of PTSD coming out of that year. It was as intense as anything I've ever done. And it's only fair to give the students the opportunity to operate as a third person on the medic units and give them more room and time to do it, because we do actually have a higher pass rate now than we did. The time I was going through, it was probably 25% or more fail rate.
What motivated you to become a preceptor?
The way we did things in those days was almost institutional hazing. It wasn't right, really, but we didn't know it at the time. We trained people the way we were trained. It was a little bit merciless. There was not much hand-holding, but if you stumbled, it was pretty hard to get back up. And I've been a medic for several years, and had a fair amount of experience evaluating students. We had a student who he's a very smart man, and he passed in the class that he was not putting it together in the field very well. And I didn't really know how to help him, because I had never seen what it was like to help somebody in the field. I'd seen lots of wisdom dumps. That doesn't really people who have structural problems with their approach to paramedicine. There came a point where he was given a timeline, a date in which he had to accumulate a certain number of passes for evaluations. And as that date approached, he failed more and more. And he was with me a lot doing gathering those fails in the field. There came a point at which I said, mathematically, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to pass. And yet this fellow, he kept coming to work and writing and participating in evaluations right until the final day. And he could have quit long before that, because there was really no way he could have passed. And it was really such a classy thing for him to do. It was a stubborn thing. I realized that. He didn't want to give up. He didn't want to say that he was quitting. But the way he carried himself through the end of that experience, it was inspiring, actually, even in the failure. And it made me realize that I had let him down, that our organization had let him down, and I didn't want to see that happen again. So in the next class, there was another student who had a similar experience in evaluations and was not putting it together, and I was asked to work with him. And so I spent a lot of time figuring out how I could help him. There are things you can do, but first you have to figure out what's going on with the patient. And if a student isn't able to do that, there's reasons for that, because he had passed all the didactic portion, he had passed all the tests, but it wouldn't happen in the field. And so we really had to stop and come up with a game plan for him. And that guy was successful after we figured out how I could help him.
So we go back to the beginning of your career as a paramedic until your last shift, which was this past Sunday. Talk a little bit about some of the big changes that you have seen during your tenure.
Seems like virtually everything has changed. We've gone from 2 medic units to 5. We've gone from solo paramedics in the field to 2 paramedic staffing. The solo work was it was very difficult, not only because you didn't have anybody there to bounce things off when you were wondering what was going on. Also, you had to sequence interventions with critical patients in a way that if you make a misstep, you'd have to back up and start over again. And so that's a big deal. Patients get a lot better care when the medic is able to think about what's going on, when there's 2 medics to talk about things. That's a big deal. We've added community paramedics. The treatments themselves have changed drastically. There are so many resuscitation medications that we gave back in those days when I started that some of them are coming back around. like Bertilium, we quit using that a long time ago, and it sounds like that might be coming back. They're big changes.
All right, Joe, tell us a little bit about the high-performance CPR and what your interest and how you drove the program from Bellingham Fire Department.
It was actually it was by accident. I was assigned light duty after a neck injury at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. One of the EMS officers came to me and said that he would like to establish a high-performance CPR, pit crew CPR program, and asked me to work on it. There wasn't a lot of direction, and we weren't really sure where we were going with it. But I put together something and turned it in. It was a call flow sheet with roles assigned to all the different players, and went back my regular assignment when my light duty assignment was done and I was healed, and kind of forgot about it. But then that summer, they asked me to put on a high-performance CPR, pit crew CPR training. And I did. We had all 4 shifts of the department come through. And I had my plan that was basically a wish list to make a medic's life easier on CPR calls. It was a disaster. The first morning, we found out that not all the AEDs were programmed the way we thought they were. We found out that the roles that I had assigned people in this thought experiment we had done, they didn't work out very well. In fact, as each day progressed, the teaching changed because we kept identifying things that were not right. And as the week went on, each day the next shift got a slightly different version of the training. And by the end of the week, we had 4 shifts with 4 different ideas of what to do. And it was terrible. And I left that training thinking that I had made things way worse. And over the course of the next year, in the field, seeing the performance, I was absolutely certain that I had made things way worse. There were a lot of mistakes made. There was a lot of confusion, and I felt pretty bad about it. But it just got worse when they called me into an award ceremony and gave me a letter of commendation for that work. And I felt it was undeserved. I was pretty displeased with the whole situation. And so over the course of the next few months, I started bringing people through on shift, bringing crews over to a training room and trying to work out what would be a legit pit crew CPR routine. And as I went through the whole process, I discovered that the roles needed to be clarified, that they needed to be practical, that they needed to be attainable. And so I started practicing with a CPR mannequin and bringing people through to run these little scenarios. And this is a mannequin. It's one of the smart mannequins that has a tablet that shows the depth of compressions. And I thought, I should figure out what this is all about. And so I started looking at the depth of compressions as people were coming through, and it was poor. We were supposed to do 2 to 2.4 inch deep compressions, and if I asked somebody to do what they believed to be 2 inch deep compressions, generally they were about 1.5 inches deep. And I realized that was the case throughout the system because no matter who I brought in, nobody hit 2 inch depth. So we had been using a Lucas device in the field for several years. And when it was first given to us, we were just told, try this on a patient, the next code you go on, and we'll see how it works. And lo and behold, the first time we put it on a patient, we got a resuscitation. Well, my partner and I, we had a run, like out of the next 5 resuscitations we were on, CPR calls we were on, I think 4 of them were resuscitations. So I was a big believer this thing actually worked. And after I saw the performance on this mannequin, it was clear to me why. It was because the Lucas device was doing AHA recommended compressions and we weren't. So we needed to improve our compressions. That was clear. We needed to have a better system for running people through the roles. That was clear. And at the time, we were only sending 3 BLS providers on CPR calls. So we needed more BLS providers. We were able to get more BLS providers. We got another crew. We We got training scheduled for CPR training for BLS crews. We got our AEDs all programmed as they should be. And we went to town with some training. We actually did pretty good. People accepted it. They embraced the training. They bought in, and they saw the need for it. And the crews did a very good job of doing what we were teaching. But we still had a problem with the Lucas. System-wide, all the medics had the same thought that I did, which was that we need to get that Lucas on. And as we looked at code stat reports from the calls, we were seeing Lucas application times of 20, 30, 40 seconds because they would do what I always did, which was just walk in and set that thing down and say, put this on. I don't care what you're doing or where you are in the cycle. Because, I mean, it had been clear to me that the patient had a better chance of survival if we put that on. But now that we were doing better CPR with good compressions, that calculus had changed. And so I started calling around for ideas on exactly how that should be applied. I talked to Jonathan Larson, had great conversations with him from the Resuscitation Academy, spoke with Mike Hilly, and I was also directed to talk to Dr. Mike Levy of Anchorage Fire Department, who is a Resuscitation Academy alumni, and he's faculty there. And I asked him about his approach to putting the Lucas on, and he was very generous with his time, and his staff also was helpful. They put the Lucas on not during a pause, a rhythm analysis pause, but they do it mid-cycle, and they are very specific about how it goes on, and it seemed to work for us. Search the internet for guidance on how to put together a really good pit crew CPR program, and there's just so much variation everywhere you look. There's different capabilities, different equipment, just a different approach all over the place. But I did find that Anchorage has a very similar system to us. They had put together a really fine product. Their high-performance CPR protocol is very good. And so we kind of adopted that. At that point, we had the AED squared away. We had figured out how we were going to put the Lucas on. We were giving good compressions, and we had our rolls set up. One thing that we didn't have was ALS participation because the system was just too stressed at the time with COVID and staffing shortfalls and everything to include the ALS personnel in the training. So we were getting great CPR prior to ALS arrival, but ALS was still kind of on a different page. We needed to get ALS in there and figure out how we were going to incorporate them. Now, the more reading we did, the more we came to realize that most ALS interventions in resuscitation are marginally effective. Not a ton of data about how the amiodarone is going to make a big difference, but one thing that does make a big difference is the BLS CPR, and the contribution that ALS has to that above all else seems to be that they can show up with a defibrillator that can be pre-charged, and they can analyze the rhythm in a third of the time that an AED can, and deliver the shock and be back on the chest less than half the time that an AED takes simply to analyze it, and they don't have to take another pause in order to deliver the shock. We spent a lot of time figuring out how to make that, how to maximize that. And once we did, it seems to be paying off in the field. I haven't seen the numbers yet, but we're very hopeful, and we're all feeling very optimistic that improving the quality of compressions, shortening the pauses, timely shocks, that's going to pay off for us.
And what's been really good is that we're going to try to introduce this system-wide for the BLS services out in the county, as well as one thing I do want to praise is that your department has committed both manpower and the financial component for this training. So both you and the department should be praised.
I'm really gratified that the department has supported the CPR program to the extent they have. The leadership is on board, and I really appreciate that.
Joe, thank you very much for joining me on my podcast. Happy retirement, and we'll be in touch so you can help me teach, hopefully in the fall.
Sounds great, Dave. Look forward to it.
Buying a home can feel like navigating uncharted waters. Redfin agents can help. They'll answer your questions with honest advice so you know exactly what you're getting into. They'll also help you tour as many homes as you want and show you what it takes to make a winning offer. With a Redfin agent on your side, you can sail straight to your dream home. Local expertise from Redfin. That's real estate done right. Tour subject to property and agent availability. Virginia Office Falls Church, VA, 844-759-7732.
Sun, surf, and seduction collide as 4 Americans return to exotic islands, hoping their sexy romances can turn into forever. Love in Paradise, the Caribbean, a 90-day story, streaming now only on Discovery Plus. Start your free trial. Terms apply.